In the dawn of the 20th century, the sprawling Russian Empire appeared to stand as an unassailable bastion of Tsarist power. Under the rule of Tsar Nicholas II, the autocracy reigned supreme over a vast and diverse territory, stretching from the forests of Eastern Europe to the steppes of Central Asia. Yet beneath this facade of stability lay a multitude of fissures, each threatening to fracture the empire's seemingly indomitable foundation. Imperial Russia was a land of stark contrasts. The glittering opulence of the Winter Palace stood in sharp relief against the grinding poverty that characterized the lives of the empire's subjects. Tsar Nicholas II, insulated from the daily realities of his people, governed over a population where as much as 85% lived in poverty. The vast majority of Russians were either peasants burdened by subsistence farming or industrial workers toiling for meager wages in rapidly growing cities. Despite the veneer of power, discontent simmered beneath the surface. The rigid social hierarchy left little room for mobility, and the lack of civil liberties stifled any hope for political reform. The Orthodox Church, a pillar of Tsarist support, preached loyalty to the autocracy. Yet even its influence was waning as Western ideas of democracy and socialism began to permeate Russian intellectual circles. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 was intended as a display of Russian might, a means to assert dominance in East Asia. Instead, it ended in a humiliating defeat that sent shockwaves through the empire. Japan's modern military and naval prowess shattered the illusion of Russian invincibility and exposed the antiquated nature of its military structures. The loss had profound implications. Internally, it drained resources and further alienated a population already struggling to survive. Soldiers returned to their homes, only to find their families in deeper poverty. And the failure of the war effort raised critical questions about the regime's ability to protect its people. If the Tsar could not win a war, how could he ensure the security and prosperity of the nation? Discontent boiled over in 1905 with the events of Bloody Sunday. On January 22nd, peaceful protesters seeking to present a petition to the Tsar were met with brutal force as soldiers opened fire on the crowd. The massacre shattered the myth of Nicholas II as a benevolent ruler and ignited a year of revolution. Strikes, peasant uprisings, and worker-led demonstrations swept the nation, demanding better working conditions, land redistribution, and political representation. Under mounting pressure, Nicholas established the Duma, a legislative body intended to placate reformists. Yet the Duma was a hollow concession, its power strictly limited, leaving the key decisions in the hands of the Tsar and perpetuating the cycle of dissatisfaction. World War I further exacerbated Russia's woes. The empire's military suffered catastrophic losses due to poor training, faulty logistics, and outdated equipment. On the home front, food shortages became unbearable as resources were diverted to the war effort, and the failure of the railway system left cities cut off from vital supplies. Public outrage grew as soldiers mutinied and civilians rioted for bread. The war's toll on the Russian psyche was immense, and the Tsar's decision to take personal command of the army only deepened the crisis. His absence from the capital left governance in the hands of Tsarina Alexandra and her confidant, Rasputin, whose influence over state affairs further eroded the regime's credibility. Rasputin's presence at court became a lightning rod for scandal. His close relationship with Alexandra, already viewed with suspicion due to her German heritage, fueled rumors and resentment. Rasputin's involvement in political decisions alienated the nobility and military, and his assassination in 1916 was a desperate attempt to restore confidence in the monarchy. Despite the conspiracy to remove him, Rasputin's influence had already irrevocably damaged the Romanovs' standing. The assassination, with its bizarre circumstances, mirrored the regime's stubborn resilience to change, sinking under the weight of its own contradictions. By early 1917, the empire teetered on the brink of collapse. The tipping point came in Petrograd, where strikes and protests paralyzed the city. Workers and soldiers, once tasked with maintaining order, joined the protests, signaling the end of Tsarist rule. On March 15th, isolated and with no support from the military or the Duma, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. This marked the end of over 300 years of Romanov rule. However, the abdication did not resolve the chaos, it merely ushered in a new era of instability. In the power vacuum left by the Tsar's abdication, a provisional government was hastily formed. Composed of elites from the Duma, this government aimed to democratize Russia, promising civil liberties and eventual elections. Yet its cautious approach alienated many, as it refused to implement radical reforms or withdraw from the disastrous war. Simultaneously, grassroots movements known as Soviets emerged, representing workers and soldiers disenchanted with the existing system. The Petrograd Soviet became particularly influential, demanding immediate solutions to the nation's crisis. A dual power struggle ensued between the provisional government and the Soviets. The former sought to establish democracy from above, while the latter pushed for immediate change from below. This conflict highlighted the deep societal divides and set the stage for further revolution. As the year progressed, the tension between these two forces intensified, foreshadowing the dramatic upheavals yet to come. The promise of a utopian future seemed ever more elusive, overshadowed by the spectre of chaos and suffering. In the aftermath of the February Revolution, Russia stood at a crossroads. The old world had crumbled, but the new one was fraught with uncertainty. The stage was set for the next chapter in the empire's tumultuous history. As the struggle for power and the dream of a better world continued to unfold. In the crucible of despair and discontent, the seeds of revolution found fertile ground in Russia. The old regime had collapsed, yet the promises of the new provisional government seemed hollow. Furious peasants demanded land redistribution, soldiers yearned for an end to the devastating war, and workers sought better conditions. Into this void of unmet needs and rising desperation stepped an exiled revolutionary with a vision for change. Vladimir Lenin. With the Great War tearing Western Europe apart, Germany saw a strategic opportunity to further destabilize Russia by facilitating Lenin's return. On April 3, 1917, Lenin arrived back in Petrograd, transported in a sealed train, a calculated move by Germany to weaken the provisional government. Lenin wasted no time in laying out his radical vision, encapsulated in what became known as the April Thesis. He called for an immediate end to the war, land for the peasants, and all power to the Soviets. His slogan, peace, land and bread, resonated profoundly with the exhausted populace. To those disillusioned by endless promises, Lenin and the Bolsheviks he led appeared as harbingers of hope and change. Their ideas spread rapidly, igniting a fervor that the provisional government struggled to contain. By the summer of 1917, the unrest had reached a boiling point. The July days saw spontaneous protests erupt across Petrograd, demanding the overthrow of the provisional government. Workers, soldiers, and sailors took to the streets in a display of mounting frustration. However, the uprising was poorly organized and ultimately failed. The provisional government, still clinging to power, responded by using loyal Cossack units and officers to crush the riots. Lenin, recognizing the danger, fled to Finland. This temporary setback did not deter the Bolsheviks. Rather, it strengthened their resolve, as they continued to be seen as the only group with a clear plan to address Russia's crisis. By October, the Bolsheviks, having gained dominance in key Soviets in Petrograd, were ready to make their move. Under the leadership of Lenin and the brilliant organizational skills of Trotsky, they meticulously planned a coup. On October 25th, according to the Julian calendar, then in use in Russia, Bolshevik forces swiftly seized the Winter Palace, where the provisional government had barricaded itself. The resistance was minimal, and the palace fell with almost no bloodshed. This marked a decisive moment in Russian history, as the Bolsheviks declared victory in the name of the Soviets they claimed to represent. Lenin's rise to power was no accident. It was a result of calculated planning and the strategic exploitation of a system on the brink of collapse. Despite their control of Petrograd, the Bolsheviks' hold over the rest of Russia was tenuous. Almost immediately, they faced resistance from a coalition of groups united only by their opposition to Bolshevik rule. This coalition, known as the White Army, comprised monarchists, liberal reformers, and other factions disillusioned by Bolshevism. Adding to this chaos were foreign powers such as Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, all worried about the spread of communism. These nations provided support to the anti-Bolshevik forces, but their interventions were sporadic and poorly coordinated, ultimately failing to alter the course of the conflict significantly. On the Bolshevik side, the newly formed Red Army was organized under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, a masterful strategist and orator. Trotsky transformed a ragtag group into a disciplined and motivated fighting force. Political commissars were embedded throughout the ranks to ensure ideological loyalty. Conscription swelled the Red Army's ranks, while deserters faced harsh punishments, including execution. The Red Army's tactics were often brutal, employing widespread repression in areas where control was tenuous. The Russian Civil War, which raged from 1918 to 1922, was not a single, unified conflict, but a series of fragmented struggles with shifting alliances and multiple factions vying for power. While the Bolsheviks controlled the industrial heartlands and crucial transportation hubs of central Russia, the White forces operated on the periphery. This geographical disadvantage, coupled with internal disunity, undermined the White Army's ability to mount a cohesive campaign. Foreign intervention briefly tipped the scales in favor of the anti-Bolshevik forces. Allied countries sent troops, weapons, and supplies to the Whites in an effort to smother the Bolshevik revolution. However, these interventions were inconsistent and lacked coordination. Western powers, still reeling from World War I, were unable or unwilling to fully commit. American troops landed in Siberia and northern Russia, but avoided major engagements, while French forces withdrew quickly after suffering losses. Ironically, these foreign interventions inflamed Russian nationalist sentiment, ultimately strengthening the Bolsheviks' position by allowing them to frame their cause as a fight against foreign invaders and a return to oppressive Tsarist rule. One of the most dramatic and symbolic acts by the Bolsheviks during the Civil War was the execution of Tsar Nicholas II and his family in 1918. This act was intended to eliminate any possibility of Nicholas becoming a rallying figure for the White forces. Beyond its immediate political implications, the execution symbolically severed Russia's ties with its imperial past. The decision, and its subsequent secrecy haunted Russian history, with the burial site only being confirmed decades later. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had emerged victorious from the chaos of the Russian Civil War, establishing uncontested control over what had been the vast Russian Empire. Their victory was not achieved through military might alone. It also relied on their ability to impose control over diverse territories, each with its own political ambitions and cultural differences. The Bolsheviks' success in consolidating power laid the foundations for the Soviet regime that would dominate Russia and its neighboring states for much of the 20th century. They restructured Russian society, imposing a new order that promised to deliver on the ideals of the revolution. Yet, the utopian future they envisioned was overshadowed by the specter of authoritarianism and repression, setting the stage for the complex and often tragic history that would follow. As the dust settled on the battlefield of revolution and civil war, Russia found itself transformed. The Bolsheviks had not only seized power, they had reshaped the very fabric of society. The echoes of their triumph and the sacrifices made resonated throughout the world, marking the dawn of a new era in global politics. The Bolshevik expansion into neighboring regions like Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasus was a significant chapter in the establishment of centralized control from Moscow. These territories, rich in resources and strategic advantages, became battlegrounds as the Bolsheviks sought to expand their influence. The Red Army played a crucial role in this expansion, moving swiftly and decisively to crush independence movements and ensure that local resistance could not undermine the new regime. The actions taken by the Bolsheviks in these regions were not solely military. Political repression was a key strategy, with the Bolsheviks often negotiating compromises with local elites, temporarily allowing them to retain some power in exchange for allegiance to the central government. This approach helped to stabilize these areas under Bolshevik control, aligning local interests with the broader goals of the revolution. The formation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, on December 30, 1922, marked a pivotal moment in world history, initially comprising Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. The USSR was conceived as a federation of equal republics united under socialist ideals. However, the reality was quite different. Decision-making was heavily centralized in Moscow, and the republics had limited autonomy. While cultural freedoms were permitted to some extent, political control remained firmly in the hands of the Bolshevik-dominated Communist Party. The new state was ideologically grounded in Marxism, Leninism, which promised a classless society. In practice, however, the Soviet Union was characterized by a centralized, one-party state that prioritized control over the revolutionary ideals it professed. The 1924 Soviet Constitution further solidified the Communist Party's dominance, establishing it as the ultimate authority in political, economic, and social life. Institutions like the Cheka, the Soviet secret police, were instrumental in maintaining this control, suppressing dissent through surveillance, arrests, and even executions. The promises of equality and self-determination were particularly complex for the ethnic and national minorities within the USSR. Initially, the Soviet government promoted cultural expression and autonomy through indigenization policies, which aimed to win the trust of minority groups. However, this approach shifted as Soviet control tightened, leading to policies of Russification, where Russian culture and language were promoted as dominant. This shift was especially pronounced in regions deemed less loyal to Moscow, where independence movements were harshly suppressed. The creation of the USSR also had significant global implications, marking the emergence of the world's first communist state. Western nations viewed the Soviet Union with suspicion, seeing it as a threat to the capitalist world order. Despite this, the USSR inspired leftist movements worldwide, providing a model of socialism that, although flawed, offered hope to those seeking alternatives to capitalism. The symbols of the Soviet Union, such as the hammer and sickle, became potent icons embodying both hope and fear, representing the complex duality of ideals and authoritarianism. Following the Russian Civil War, the country was left in ruins. Famine and devastation were widespread, posing a significant challenge to Lenin's government. In response to the dire economic situation, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, an NEP, in 1921. This policy marked a pragmatic retreat from strict socialist principles, allowing for some elements of capitalism to revive the economy. Peasants were permitted to sell surplus goods, and small businesses could operate privately. The state retained control over heavy industry and foreign trade, but the NEP provided a much-needed boost to agriculture and commerce. The NEP's impact was immediate and positive. Agricultural production increased, alleviating famine in urban centers, and the economy began to recover. However, this economic liberalization did not equate to political freedom. The government maintained a tight grip on power, suppressing dissent even from former allies. The Kronstadt Rebellion of 1921 exemplified this tension. Sailors at the Kronstadt naval base, once staunch supporters of the Bolsheviks, revolted, demanding greater freedoms and an end to authoritarianism. The government's response was swift and brutal, labeling the rebels as counter-revolutionaries and crushing the uprising. This event highlighted the ongoing struggle between reform and control within the Soviet Union, as the government balanced economic pragmatism with political repression. The establishment of the USSR and the policies it implemented had far-reaching consequences, shaping the trajectory of the country and its role on the global stage. As the Soviet Union continued to evolve, it became increasingly clear that the promises of equality and freedom were often overshadowed by the reality of centralized control and repression. The legacy of these early years would continue to influence the Soviet Union's development and its interactions with the rest of the world, setting the stage for future conflicts and challenges. In the twilight of his life, Vladimir Lenin found himself increasingly aware of the fragility of the revolution he had helped to ignite. The new economic policy, while a necessary deviation from strict socialist principles, provided a temporary respite for the struggling Soviet economy. However, it also sowed seeds of concern within Lenin. He viewed the NEP as a compromise, a necessary evil to stabilize the country, but feared it might lead to the resurgence of capitalist tendencies. As Lenin's health deteriorated, his apprehensions grew more pronounced. His first stroke in 1922 left him incapacitated, and a second stroke in 1923 effectively ended his active involvement in politics. Amidst these personal challenges, Lenin became increasingly wary of the concentration of power in the hands of certain individuals within the party, most notably Joseph Stalin. In his final writings, Lenin articulated his concerns, describing Stalin as too rude and unfit for leadership. He feared that Stalin's growing influence could threaten the collective leadership and democratic ideals that he envisioned for the Soviet Union. Tragically, Lenin passed away in January 1924 before he could act on these warnings, leaving the future of the party and the nation in perilous uncertainty. Lenin's death in 1924 created an immediate power vacuum at the apex of the Communist Party. With no clear succession plan or mechanism for leadership transition, the stage was set for a fierce power struggle amongst Lenin's closest associates. Leon Trotsky, a brilliant orator and strategist who had played a pivotal role in the Bolshevik Revolution and the Civil War, appeared to many as the natural successor. However, his intellectualism and perceived aloofness made him a polarizing figure within the party. In contrast, Joseph Stalin, who held the seemingly mundane position of General Secretary, was quietly amassing power. This role, often underestimated by his rivals, gave him unparalleled control over the party's bureaucracy and the ability to place loyalists in key positions. Stalin's strategic acumen lay in his ability to exploit the divisions among his rivals. He initially aligned himself with figures like Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev to isolate Trotsky, painting him as overly radical and disconnected from the proletariat. Trotsky's absence from Lenin's funeral, due to either misinformation or illness, was masterfully used by Stalin to question his loyalty and dedication. Stalin, presenting himself as the humble and devoted heir to Lenin, capitalized on Trotsky's missteps and gradually edged him out of the central corridors of power. In an act of symbolism and propaganda, Soviet leaders decided to embalm Lenin's body and place it on display in a grand mausoleum in Red Square, Moscow. This decision was made despite Lenin's explicit wishes for a simple burial. The embalming and public display of Lenin's body transformed him into an eternal symbol of revolutionary fervor and party doctrine. The mausoleum became a place of pilgrimage for Soviet citizens and foreign visitors alike, reinforcing Lenin's mythic status and the party's narrative of continuity and stability. The decision to embalm Lenin was not merely about honoring a fallen leader. It was a calculated move to solidify the ideological foundations of the Soviet state, offering the public a tangible connection to the revolution's legacy. The mausoleum, with its stark geometric lines and austere architecture, stood as a testament to the power of the Communist Party and its commitment to Lenin's vision, even as the reality diverged from the ideals he espoused. Joseph Stalin's rise to supremacy within the Soviet Union was marked by strategic brilliance and ruthless ambition. He meticulously built a network of supporters and allies within the Communist Party, leveraging his position as General Secretary to consolidate control over the party's machinery. Stalin's approach was one of calculated patience, allowing him to outmaneuver rivals who underestimated his capabilities. His ability to manipulate the party's internal dynamics, forming and dissolving alliances as needed, was instrumental in his ascent. Initially, Stalin aligned himself with Zinoviev and Kamenev to marginalize Trotsky. But once Trotsky was sidelined, he turned on his former allies. Stalin's betrayal of Zinoviev and Kamenev was executed with precision. He accused them of factionalism and undermining party unity, leading to their political isolation and eventual expulsion. Stalin's consolidation of power was not merely a political victory, it was a transformation of the Soviet Union's leadership structure, where dissent was systematically eradicated and loyalty to Stalin became paramount. By the end of the 1920s, Stalin had emerged as the uncontested leader of the Soviet Union, fundamentally reshaping the nation's political landscape in his image. Leon Trotsky's fall from grace was both a consequence of his own miscalculations and the machinations of Joseph Stalin. Despite his intellectual prowess and contributions to Marxist theory, Trotsky's inability to build a broad base of support within the party proved to be his Achilles' heel. Stalin skillfully portrayed Trotsky as a detached intellectual, out of touch with the needs of ordinary Soviet citizens. Publicly, Stalin orchestrated a campaign to discredit Trotsky, emphasizing his perceived arrogance and ideological extremism. Trotsky's absence from Lenin's funeral provided Stalin with the perfect opportunity to question his commitment to the party, further eroding Trotsky's standing among his peers. Stalin's public displays of mourning for Lenin contrasted sharply with Trotsky's absence, reinforcing Stalin's image as the true custodian of Lenin's legacy. As Stalin's influence grew, Trotsky found himself increasingly marginalized, eventually being expelled from the Communist Party and exiled from the Soviet Union. Trotsky's intellectual legacy, however, continued to resonate with some factions, but his political power had been effectively neutralized by Stalin's relentless campaign. Under Stalin's regime, the Soviet Union witnessed the emergence of a cult of personality, where Stalin himself was elevated to an almost divine status. Propaganda portrayed him as a wise and benevolent leader, infallible and intimately connected to the people. The cult of personality was not merely about glorifying Stalin. It was a tool of political control, suppressing dissent and unifying the nation under a singular vision. Historical revisionism became a hallmark of Stalin's rule. Photographs and documents were altered to erase rivals and reframe history, to emphasize Stalin's central role in the Soviet Union's successes. This systematic rewriting of history served to consolidate Stalin's position and reinforce his narrative of being the true architect of Soviet progress. The implications for Soviet history were profound, as generations of citizens were educated under a distorted narrative that glorified Stalin and minimized the contributions of others. In the late 1920s, Stalin initiated a radical policy of collectivization, aiming to transform the agricultural landscape of the Soviet Union. This policy forced millions of peasants to abandon private farming and join state-controlled collective farms. Stalin justified collectivization as a means to modernize agriculture, increase food production, and fund industrialization. However, the reality was far harsher. The policy was implemented with brutal efficiency, targeting the so-called kulaks, or wealthier peasants, as enemies of the state. In reality, many of those labeled as kulaks were merely independent farmers who owned slightly more than their neighbors. Collectivization led to widespread disruption and suffering in the countryside. Peasants faced forced requisitioning of grain, livestock, and land, leading to food shortages and famine. Resistance was met with severe repression, as the state sought to crush any opposition to its policies. The human cost of collectivization was staggering, with millions of lives lost to famine and forced labor. Despite the rhetoric of progress and modernization, the policy left a legacy of hardship and resentment among the Soviet peasantry. Fear and surveillance became central to Stalin's regime, underpinning his control over Soviet society. The secret police, restructured as the GPU and later the NKVD, played a crucial role in maintaining an atmosphere of fear and obedience. Surveillance was pervasive, with citizens constantly monitored for signs of dissent or disloyalty. The climate of fear extended beyond the political sphere, affecting everyday life and relationships. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious activities, creating a society where trust was eroded and paranoia was rampant. Stalin's regime used fear as a tool to suppress opposition and ensure compliance with state policies. The consequences for those who opposed or were perceived to oppose Stalin were severe, with imprisonment, exile, or execution being common fates. The impact of this pervasive fear on Soviet society was profound, shaping the nation's culture and psyche for generations. As Stalin's grip tightened, the Soviet Union became a state where dissent was dangerous and conformity was essential for survival. In conclusion, the years following Lenin's death marked a pivotal period in Soviet history, characterized by power struggles, political maneuvering, and the consolidation of Stalin's authoritarian rule. The legacy of these years would cast a long shadow over the Soviet Union, shaping its future and defining its interactions with the world. The Soviet campaign of dekulakization was a brutal and sweeping offensive aimed at dismantling the kulak class, perceived as a threat to socialist progress. The term kulak was broadly applied, often including even moderate, hard-working farmers whose only crime was owning a small amount of property. In a frenzy of state-sponsored violence, thousands were arrested, exiled to remote labor camps, or executed. Countless more were stripped of their homes and possessions, their lives turned upside down by the relentless march of ideology over humanity. The Soviet government used propaganda as a tool to justify these harsh measures, painting the kulaks as greedy exploiters of the working class. This narrative was crucial in garnering public support for the campaign, though it often masked the indiscriminate nature of the purges. Comparisons with other historical land reforms reveal the extreme measures unique to this Soviet policy. Unlike gradual or incentivized reforms seen elsewhere, dekulakization was characterized by immediate, often violent upheaval. The psychological impact on rural communities was profound. Families who had lived and worked on their land for generations were suddenly uprooted, their identities and livelihoods shattered. The state sought to erase the past, but the scars left behind were deep and enduring. Faced with the loss of their land, many peasants resisted in desperation. Rather than submit to state control, they destroyed livestock and crops, acts of defiance that further fueled the crisis. Between 1929 and 1933, millions of animals were slaughtered, crippling the rural economy. This self-destructive resistance only deepened the agricultural crisis, with production plummeting as a result. Yet Stalin remained unmoved, determined to impose his vision of a collectivized agricultural system at any cost. Case studies of peasant rebellions reveal the depth of resistance. In some areas, entire communities rose up against the state, only to be met with brutal suppression. The state's response was typically harsh, involving mass arrests, executions, and deportations. These confrontations underscored the cultural significance of land ownership in rural Russia, where land was not just an economic resource, but a symbol of identity and heritage. Nowhere was the impact of collectivization more devastating than in Ukraine, where it culminated in the Holodomor, a catastrophic famine from 1932 to 1933. Soviet policies, combined with peasant resistance, created a perfect storm that left millions starving. Systematic grain requisitions stripped rural villages bare, leaving families to die in their homes while the state continued to export grain abroad. The Soviet leadership's denial of the famine's existence was strategic, aiming to maintain an image of success and stability. International reactions to the famine varied, with some countries expressing outrage, while others remained silent, swayed by Soviet propaganda or geopolitical considerations. Eyewitness accounts from survivors paint a harrowing picture of the suffering endured by Ukrainians who were punished for simply trying to survive. The long-term effects on Ukrainian identity and culture were profound, with the famine leaving a legacy of trauma and mistrust that persists to this day. In 1928, Stalin launched the first five-year plan, an ambitious blueprint for transforming the Soviet Union into an industrial powerhouse. The focus was on heavy industry, with steel, coal, oil, and machinery taking precedence over consumer goods and living standards. The state sought nothing less than complete control over the economy, with centrally planned quotas dictating every aspect of production. The targets set by the plan were often wildly unrealistic, demanding factories double or triple their output overnight. Despite these challenges, reports of success flowed in, as Soviet officials eager to maintain appearances reported inflated figures. Infrastructure projects like Magnitogorsk, a massive steel production hub, became symbols of Stalin's vision. Interestingly, the Soviet reliance on foreign expertise, particularly American engineers, highlighted the contradictions in the state's rhetoric of independence. The human cost of these achievements was staggering. Forced labor became a cornerstone of Soviet industrial projects, with the expanding Gulag system providing a ready supply of workers. Conditions in these labor camps were harsh, with prisoners subjected to grueling work under extreme conditions. Mortality rates were high, with exhaustion, disease, and harsh weather claiming countless lives. Regular workers faced their own set of challenges, with harsh quotas and unsafe conditions the norm. Factories monitored employees closely, and those who failed to meet expectations faced public humiliation or worse. Despite these inefficiencies, the industrial gains by the end of the plan were undeniable, with significant increases in steel production and electrification. Soviet propaganda played a crucial role in shaping both domestic and international perceptions of the country's industrial success. Figures like Alexei Stakhanov, who reportedly mined multiple times his daily coal quota in a single shift, were celebrated as heroes. These stories, whether true or exaggerated, were used to inspire workers and reinforce the values of hard work and sacrifice for the state. The influence of Soviet propaganda extended beyond its borders, with many in the West viewing the Soviet Union as a model of rapid industrialization. This narrative, however, often obscured the human and social costs of these achievements. The rise of industry brought with it a wave of urbanization, as millions flocked to cities in search of work. This rapid growth strained urban centers, leading to severe housing shortages and inadequate infrastructure. Families were crammed into shared apartments or temporary barracks, with access to basic amenities like clean water and sanitation lagging far behind. The transformation from rural to urban life was profound, with many struggling to adapt to the new realities of industrial work. Government policies on urban development were often reactive, struggling to keep pace with the demands of a burgeoning workforce. Despite the focus on industrial growth, food shortages remained a persistent issue, affecting living standards and creating social unrest. Industrial centers prioritized grain shipments for workers, but shortages persisted, forcing many families to rely on meager rations. The black market and informal economy flourished during these times, as citizens sought alternative means of survival. The state's narrative on food security often blamed external factors or sabotage, deflecting attention from the systemic issues at play. The psychological impact of scarcity was significant, with citizens enduring constant anxiety over their next meal. In conclusion, the Soviet Union's drive for industrialization under Stalin was a complex saga of ambition and sacrifice. While the achievements were significant, the human and social costs were immense, leaving a legacy of trauma and transformation. The era reshaped the Soviet landscape, both physically and culturally, setting the stage for the nation's future challenges and triumphs. By the dawn of the 1930s, Joseph Stalin had already begun to reshape the Soviet Union into an industrial colossus. The country, once primarily agrarian, was now a burgeoning powerhouse capable of producing weapons, machinery, and heavy equipment at rates that startled the world. Stalin's ambitious five-year plans laid the foundation for massive industrial growth, propelling the Soviet Union toward becoming a superpower. Factories sprung up like mushrooms after rain, and entire cities were born from the ground up, dedicated to churning out the steel and machinery that would power the Soviet dream. However, this rapid industrialization was not achieved without significant sacrifice. The human cost was staggering, with forced labor camps and harsh working conditions being the norm rather than the exception. Many workers toiled under extreme pressure, driven by the relentless demands of quotas that seemed to disregard their well-being. This transformation brought about a dark irony. The tools of progress were forged from the sweat and blood of those who suffered most under Stalin's regime. Despite the Soviet Union's newfound industrial might, the societal scars ran deep, etched permanently into the collective memory of its people. In the shadow of industrial progress, another more sinister transformation took place. The Great Purge, or the Great Terror, swept across the Soviet Union like a dark storm in the mid-1930s. What began ostensibly as a campaign to root out enemies of the state quickly evolved into a ruthless tool of control, wielded by Stalin to eliminate any perceived threats to his power. No one was truly safe from the reach of this purge. Loyal communists who had dedicated their lives to the cause, esteemed military leaders, intellectuals whose only crime was to think, and ordinary citizens were all ensnared in the paranoia that gripped the nation. Accusations were often baseless, ranging from espionage to vague charges of counter-revolutionary activities. A simple denunciation, sometimes motivated by personal vendettas, could irrevocably ruin lives. Reality held little sway in the era of the purge. Fear was the currency of the day. It was a time when trust was a luxury few could afford, and silence became the most reliable means of survival. One of the most chilling aspects of Stalin's purge was the staged show trials. These macabre spectacles were designed to publicly humiliate and destroy those who once stood alongside Lenin. Prominent figures like Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin found themselves paraded before the world, accused of absurd crimes, such as plotting with foreign powers or conspiring to overthrow the government. These trials were theatrical in nature, each confession extracted through torture and coercion, each verdict predetermined. The defendants, once powerful men, reduced to shadows of their former selves, confessed to crimes they never committed, all to the applause of a state eager to rewrite its own history. For Stalin, these trials served a dual purpose. They not only eliminated rivals, but also allowed him to reshape the narrative of the Bolshevik Revolution, erasing the contributions of others and firmly establishing himself as the rightful successor to Lenin's legacy. Through these public spectacles, Stalin sought to craft a version of history that would endure long after the last shot was fired. Stalin's paranoia extended beyond political rivals to the very forces that were supposed to protect the Soviet Union. The Red Army, once feared by enemies and respected by allies, was not immune to the reach of the purge. Thousands of officers, including many of the most competent commanders, were arrested and executed in a wave of repression that decimated the military's leadership. Entire layers of command were wiped out, leaving the Soviet military dangerously weakened. This purge of the Red Army came at a perilous time, as tensions in Europe rose and the specter of war loomed large. With key military leaders gone, the Soviet Union found itself ill, prepared for the challenges that lay ahead, particularly the impending invasion by Nazi Germany. The strategic implications were dire, and the consequences of this decimation would be felt acutely in the early years of World War II. Parallel to the purges, the expansion of the Gulag system marked another dark chapter in Stalin's reign. These forced labor camps, scattered across the Soviet Union's most inhospitable regions, became a tool for both political repression and economic exploitation. Millions of people were swept into these camps on suspicion of disloyalty, often following denunciations by neighbors or colleagues. In the gulags, prisoners faced brutal conditions. They endured freezing winters, sweltering summers, and grueling physical labor, constructing railways, factories, and even entire cities. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion claimed countless lives, yet the demands for productivity never waned. The Gulag system became an integral part of the Soviet economy, with entire industrial projects dependent on this expendable labor force. Despite the suffering, the state reaped the benefits of this coerced labor, further fueling Stalin's vision of a modernized Soviet Union. In August 1939, the world was stunned by a political alliance that defied conventional logic. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, brought together two ideologically opposed regimes in a pact of non-aggression. Despite their differences, both powers shared a desire for territorial expansion and a temporary peace along their borders. The secret protocol of the pact revealed their true intentions, dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence and plotting the fates of countries such as Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states. This agreement set the stage for Germany's invasion of Poland, triggering World War II, and the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland soon followed. For Stalin, the pact was a strategic maneuver intended to buy time to bolster Soviet defenses while Germany engaged with Western Europe. However, this calculation would prove costly, as Stalin ignored multiple warnings about Hitler's ambitions, leaving the Soviet Union vulnerable to the coming onslaught. Following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union moved swiftly to expand its territorial reach. The annexation of the Baltic states and parts of Romania demonstrated Stalin's appetite for a buffer zone against potential aggression. However, Finland's refusal to accede to Soviet demands led to the Winter War, a conflict that exposed significant weaknesses in the Red Army. Despite the eventual Soviet victory, the fierce Finnish resistance inflicted heavy losses on Soviet forces and highlighted the consequences of Stalin's earlier military purges. This war, although resulting in territorial gains for the Soviet Union, underscored the need for a reassessment of military strategy and leadership. On June 22, 1941, the illusion of security shattered as Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of Soviet territory. The scale of the attack was unprecedented, with millions of Axis troops storming across the borders, supported by a formidable array of tanks and aircraft. The initial Soviet response was chaotic, with entire divisions overwhelmed and millions of soldiers captured in the early months of the conflict. The Red Army, weakened by purges and unprepared for the scale of the assault, struggled to contain the German advance. Cities fell, and vast regions, including Ukraine and Belarus, were occupied by Nazi forces, resulting in staggering losses for the Soviet Union. The strategic and human toll of the invasion was immense, forcing the Soviet Union to adapt its military strategy and mobilize every resource in its fight for survival. In conclusion, the 1930s were a decade of profound transformation for the Soviet Union. Stalin's efforts to industrialize the nation and consolidate power came at an unimaginable cost, leaving deep scars on the fabric of Soviet society. The legacy of this era was a complex tapestry of progress and repression, setting the stage for the monumental challenges that lay ahead as the world plunged into the chaos of World War II. The German invasion of the Soviet Union on June 26, 1941, marked a day of profound shock and disbelief for Joseph Stalin and his government. Operation Barbarossa, the codename for the invasion, shattered the fragile peace established by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Initially paralyzed by the betrayal, Stalin retreated into a period of silence for several days, a reaction that left the Soviet leadership in disarray as chaos unfolded across the Western Front. However, Stalin soon regained his composure, recognizing the dire need for a radical reorganization of the Soviet war effort. Abandoning the strict communist rhetoric that had previously defined Soviet propaganda, Stalin reframed the conflict as the Great Patriotic War. This was a desperate fight for national survival, designed to rally the Soviet people around a common cause. Propaganda became a crucial tool in this effort, with posters and radio broadcasts urging citizens to defend their motherland from the invading forces. Even individuals who had grievances against the regime found themselves united in the fight for their homeland, recognizing the existential threat posed by the German invasion. The rebranding of the war fostered a sense of national unity, essential for the endurance and eventual triumph of the Soviet Union. Despite the rallying cry, the initial invasion left deep and lasting scars across the Soviet Union, scars that would take years to heal. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939, was initially heralded by Stalin as a diplomatic triumph. Through this agreement, the Soviet Union temporarily gained land and influence in Eastern Europe, but the pact also exposed countries like Poland to unimaginable devastation. This diplomatic maneuver severely tarnished the international reputation of both signatories, revealing the pragmatic and ruthless nature of Soviet foreign policy. Stalin's willingness to collaborate with Hitler was driven by the desire to secure Soviet borders and buy time for military preparation. Ironically, this agreement, intended to prolong peace, served only to accelerate the USSR's entry into World War II under devastatingly unprepared conditions. The strategic miscalculations involved in the pact became glaringly evident as the German invasion unfolded. Stalin's initial trust in Hitler and the temporary territorial gains proved to be a costly error, one that would haunt Soviet diplomacy for years to come. In the weeks preceding Operation Barbarossa, Soviet intelligence intercepted over 80 separate warnings about an impending invasion. Yet Stalin, convinced these were disinformation, rejected them all. Even as German troops amassed on the border, Soviet officers were ordered not to provoke them, leaving key aircraft grounded and vulnerable to destruction. This atmosphere of denial and miscalculation within Soviet leadership set the stage for unparalleled destruction as the USSR entered its bloodiest era. The initial months of the invasion shattered the Red Army, with entire divisions annihilated and valuable industrial regions in the West falling to the advancing Germans. Stalin's distrust in his advisors, and the broader implications for Soviet military preparedness underscored the dire consequences of these intelligence failures. Faced with the catastrophic initial setbacks, Stalin and his leadership scrambled to respond to the crisis. In a dramatic effort to rebuild the war effort, the Soviet Union undertook the massive relocation of critical industries, thousands of kilometers eastward, beyond the Ural Mountains, to protect them from German airstrikes. This monumental logistical operation involved packing factories, machinery, and even workers onto trains and moving them to safety. Despite the chaos, this relocation proved successful. Within months, production resumed deep in the Soviet interior, supplying much-needed tanks, artillery, and ammunition for the front lines. The Red Army itself underwent radical reorganization, with morale dangerously low and soldiers overwhelmed by constant defeats. Stalin issued a historic decree known as Order No. 227, famously encapsulated by the phrase, "Not one step back." This order forbade retreat under any circumstances, with special blocking units stationed behind Soviet lines to prevent soldiers from fleeing, even at gunpoint. Penal battalions, composed of convicted soldiers and political prisoners, were used for the most dangerous missions, essentially as expendable forces. Though brutal, these measures reflected the desperation of the situation and contributed to the hardening of Soviet defenses. The nearly 900-day siege of Leningrad stands as one of the greatest tests of Soviet resilience during World War II. German and Finnish forces encircled the city, cutting off all land routes for supplies. Starvation ravaged the civilian population, with over 1 million people perishing, many from hunger alone. Despite these horrific conditions, the city refused to submit. Civilians worked tirelessly to build fortifications and operate weapons, while music concerts were held to maintain morale, even as shells rained down. Supply routes across the frozen Lake Ladoga, known as the Road of Life, became a lifeline during the harshest winters, ferrying essential supplies into the besieged city. Leningrad's survival became a symbol of Soviet determination, showcasing the indomitable spirit of its people in the face of overwhelming adversity. By late 1942, the tide of war began to shift with the Battle of Stalingrad, a brutal months-long conflict characterized by intense urban combat. Entire city blocks were destroyed, and battles were measured in inches as Soviet forces, commanded by General Zhukov, turned the tables on the Germans. By encircling and trapping the German Sixth Army, the Soviets forced to surrender in early 1943. This victory marked not only a turning point on the Eastern Front, but also an unmistakable signal that the Red Army was regaining its strength and confidence. The Battle of Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet tenacity and strategic brilliance, with the victory boosting morale and altering the course of the war. Women played an essential role in the Soviet war effort, both behind the scenes and on the battlefield. Female snipers, like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, became legends for their precision, while all-female air regiments, such as the famous Night Witches, carried out daring bombing raids in obsolete biplanes. On the home front, women staffed factories, produced weapons, and kept supply chains running. Their contributions were not just significant, they were vital to the USSR's survival. At its industrial peak, the Soviet Union outpaced German production in key areas, particularly tanks. The T-34, renowned for its versatility and simplicity, became the backbone of the Red Army. Meanwhile, Soviet partisans operating behind enemy lines sabotaged German railroads, disrupted supply lines, and proved to be a constant thorn in the Wehrmacht's side. These partisan efforts forced the Germans to divert resources they couldn't spare, weakening their positions on the front. By 1945, the Red Army had transformed from a defeated force into one capable of decisive victories. Fighting their way into Eastern Europe, Soviet troops stormed Berlin in April, raising their flag atop the Reichstag in one of the war's most iconic moments. But victory came at an unimaginable cost. Over 27 million Soviet soldiers and civilians died during the war, making the Soviet Union's sacrifice the highest of any nation involved. The devastation across the USSR left scars that would endure for decades. Incredibly, even in the darkest days, Soviet ingenuity found ways to strike fear into the enemy. The Night Witches, an all-female squadron, conducted bombing raids so quietly that German soldiers believed they were haunting spirits. Flying outdated planes, they would cut their engines before releasing bombs, relying on silence as their weapon. It was this blend of grit, sacrifice, and ingenuity that ultimately drove the Soviet war effort to victory, securing the survival of the USSR, but leaving deep wounds across its society and people. The Soviet Union emerged victorious over Nazi Germany, its military occupying vast swaths of Eastern and Central Europe. This was not just a military triumph, it was the moment Stalin sought to secure the USSR's position as a global superpower. No longer isolated, the Soviet Union now held sway over a dozen nations, using its victory to expand its influence and reshape the post-war world. But that influence came with the weight of immense loss and the challenge of rebuilding a nation scarred by the horrors of war. The end of World War II marked a significant turning point in the geopolitical landscape of Europe. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, emerged as a dominant force, poised to reshape borders and assert its influence across the continent. This era was characterized by a series of strategic territorial expansions and political maneuvers that altered the map of Eastern Europe. Stalin's vision of creating a buffer zone of friendly states was not merely a defensive strategy, but a calculated move to establish Soviet hegemony. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were reintegrated into the Soviet Union, a move justified by Stalin as reclaiming historical territories. Eastern Poland, parts of Finland, and territories from Romania and Germany were also absorbed, expanding the Soviet Union's reach to an unprecedented scale. This expansion was not without its consequences. Local populations found themselves under the new regime's control, often facing drastic changes to their way of life. The imposition of communist governments led to significant social and economic upheaval, as traditional structures were dismantled and replaced with Soviet-style administration. Neighboring countries watched these developments with apprehension, aware of the implications for regional stability. The geopolitical shift created a clear divide between East and West, setting the stage for future confrontations. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences were pivotal in shaping post-war Europe, involving intense negotiations among the Allied leaders. Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, followed by Truman, engaged in discussions that would determine the fate of millions. While publicly focused on restoring peace, these meetings were deeply concerned with dividing Europe into spheres of influence. Stalin's insistence on a Soviet sphere was driven by historical perspective, citing past invasions as justification for a buffer zone. The agreements reached at these conferences were fraught with tension and mistrust. Each leader had distinct objectives, often at odds with one another. Stalin sought security and control, while the Western leaders aimed to promote democracy and rebuild war conflict-torn regions. Promises of free elections and self-determination were often sidelined in favor of strategic interests. The long-term effects of these conferences were profound, laying the groundwork for the Cold War's ideological and political battles. Winston Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech captured the essence of the division that had descended upon Europe. The continent was now split between the Soviet-controlled Eastern Bloc and the Western nations, aligned with the United States. This division was not just ideological but physical, with borders fortified and societies polarized. Life behind the Iron Curtain was marked by the imposition of communist regimes loyal to Moscow. Countries within the Eastern Bloc experienced varying degrees of Soviet control, often enforced through political coercion and military presence. Propaganda played a crucial role in maintaining Soviet influence, portraying the USSR as a liberator and protector against Western imperialism. Economically and socially, Eastern Europe faced significant challenges, with centralized planning and collectivization transforming traditional economies and lifestyles. The impact on individual freedoms was profound, as dissent was often met with repression and persecution. The immediate post-war period saw the emergence of tensions between the Soviet Union and Western powers, marking the beginning of the Cold War. Ideological differences between capitalism and communism, once simmering beneath the surface, now became the central battleground of global politics. Key incidents, such as the Berlin blockade, highlighted the growing divide and the willingness of both sides to assert their dominance. The formation of military alliances further solidified this division. NATO, established in 1949, represented a collective defense strategy among Western nations, while the Warsaw Pact, formed in 1955, united the Eastern Bloc under Soviet leadership. Espionage and intelligence played a critical role in this era, with both sides engaging in covert operations to gather information and undermine each other. The Cold War was characterized by a series of proxy conflicts, diplomatic standoffs, and an ever-present threat of nuclear confrontation. The nuclear arms race was a defining feature of the Cold War, with both the United States and the Soviet Union vying for supremacy in destructive capability. The successful detonation of the Soviet Union's first atomic bomb in 1949 marked a significant milestone, shattering the brief American monopoly on nuclear weapons. This achievement was the result of extensive espionage efforts, with Soviet agents infiltrating Western nuclear programs to acquire critical information. The arms race escalated rapidly, with the development of more powerful hydrogen bombs. By the early 1950s, both superpowers possessed arsenals capable of annihilating each other several times over. The concept of mutually assured destruction emerged as a central tenet of global military strategy. While terrifying, MAD paradoxically helped maintain a fragile peace, as neither side could risk initiating a nuclear conflict without facing total destruction. The psychological impact on global populations was profound, with the constant threat of nuclear war shaping public consciousness and policy decisions. On the domestic front, Stalin used the victory in World War II to consolidate his authoritarian rule over the Soviet Union. The immense sacrifices made during the war were leveraged to justify continued repression and control. Propaganda depicted Stalin as the architect of victory, a leader whose firm hand had saved the nation from annihilation. Despite the war's end, repression persisted, with political opponents, war prisoners, and suspected collaborators often ending up in the expanding Gulag system. Stalin's policies had a profound impact on Soviet society, with the expansion of state control and the suppression of dissent defining the post-war era. Economically, the Soviet Union faced significant challenges in rebuilding after the war. The rejection of the US Marshall Plan, viewed as a capitalist ploy, led to the establishment of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. This organization aimed to create an independent economic sphere within the Eastern Bloc. Rebuilding efforts were slow, with industries in ruins and cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad bearing scars of immense destruction. Despite these challenges, investment in heavy industry surged, fueled by reparations from Axis powers and forced labor programs. The Soviet Union sought to demonstrate its self-sufficiency and ideological superiority through these efforts, setting the stage for future economic developments. The post-war period also saw significant advancements in Soviet science and technology. The capture of German scientists and engineers played a crucial role in building the USSR's early missile and space programs. Figures like Helmut Greutrup laid the groundwork for Soviet military advances during the Cold War. These innovations were not limited to military applications. Many developments found their way into civilian industries, driving progress in fields from chemistry to aviation. The Soviet Union's scientific achievements became a source of national pride and a tool for projecting its global standing. As the Soviet Union solidified its position as a superpower, the world entered a new era, defined by ideological rivalry and the constant threat of conflict. The Cold War's legacy would shape international relations for decades, influencing political, economic, and social dynamics worldwide. The next chapter will explore the cultural and societal impacts of this era, delving into the everyday realities of life under the shadow of the Cold War. In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union emerged not only as a military powerhouse, but also as a formidable ideological force on the global stage. Moscow sought to extend its influence across continents, funding revolutionary movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These efforts were not merely acts of geopolitical maneuvering. They were deeply entwined with the Soviet Union's self-image as the champion of anti-colonialism and socialism. By supporting liberation movements against colonial powers, the USSR aimed to spread its socialist ideals, presenting itself as a beacon of hope for oppressed peoples worldwide. The Soviet Union's involvement in these regions often meant providing financial and military aid to leftist movements, helping them to gain ground against colonial rulers or right-wing governments. This support was both strategic and ideological, as it allowed the USSR to establish allies and potentially expand its sphere of influence. For many in the West, these actions were seen as a direct threat, fueling fears of a communist expansion that could eventually encircle the globe. Western nations, particularly the United States, viewed the spread of communism as a challenge to democracy and capitalism, prompting them to counter Soviet influence through their own support of anti-communist regimes. The Cold War thus intensified, with both superpowers engaged in a global struggle for political and ideological supremacy. As the USSR expanded its influence abroad, Joseph Stalin's later years were marked by increasing paranoia and a tightening grip on power. His reign was defined by a pervasive fear of betrayal, leading to a series of purges that targeted perceived enemies within the Soviet Union. Stalin's suspicion extended even to those within his inner circle, as he became obsessed with the notion of internal conspiracies. One of the most notorious examples of this paranoia was the Doctor's Plot of 1952, a fabricated conspiracy alleging that a group of Jewish doctors was plotting to assassinate Soviet leaders. This so-called plot was rooted in anti-Semitism and served as a pretext for further purges, escalating fears of internal enemies and leading to numerous arrests and executions. The political climate under Stalin was one of fear and repression, with millions suffering in labor camps or executed under the guise of protecting the state from imagined threats. The purges had a profound impact on Soviet society, instilling a deep sense of mistrust and stifling any potential dissent. Personal accounts from victims of these purges reveal the sheer brutality and arbitrary nature of Stalin's regime, as countless lives were destroyed based on unfounded accusations. Stalin's death in 1953 marked a turning point for the Soviet Union, as the nation grappled with the sudden void left by its long-standing leader. The ensuing power struggle within the Communist Party was intense, with various factions vying for control of the state. Nikita Khrushchev, a relatively unassuming figure, gradually maneuvered his way to the top, outmaneuvering rivals such as Lavrenti Beria, the feared former head of the secret police, and Georgy Malenkov, a more conservative contender. This transition was anything but smooth, characterized by clandestine political battles and shifting allegiances. By 1956, Khrushchev had solidified his position as the leader of the Soviet Union, and the direction of the USSR began to shift under his leadership. Khrushchev's rise to power signaled a departure from the oppressive policies of Stalin, paving the way for a period of relative liberalization and reform. In February 1956, during a closed session of the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev delivered what became known as the secret speech. This address marked a dramatic departure from the past, as Khrushchev openly condemned Stalin's cult of personality, his purges, and the reign of terror that had gripped the nation for decades. Khrushchev's speech was a calculated move, aimed at discrediting hardliners within the party and clearing the path for his reformist agenda. The speech sent shockwaves through the Soviet Union and the broader communist world, initiating a period known as the Khrushchev Thaw. This era was characterized by a cautious easing of repression, with political prisoners released en masse from labor camps and censorship slightly relaxed. Cultural and intellectual life began to flourish as artists and writers explored themes of oppression and humanity, albeit within the constraints of state control. Works like Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich offered a glimpse into the harsh realities of Soviet life, resonating with a population eager for change. Despite these reforms, the thaw had its limits, as the Soviet leadership remained wary of challenges to its authority. Khrushchev's domestic policies extended beyond political reform, as he sought to revitalize the Soviet economy through a series of ambitious initiatives. He aimed to shift the focus from heavy industry and military production toward consumer goods and agriculture, hoping to improve living standards for ordinary citizens. One of Khrushchev's most infamous policies was his enthusiasm for corn, which he believed could revolutionize Soviet agriculture. Inspired by American farming techniques, Khrushchev launched aggressive campaigns to expand corn cultivation across the USSR. However, these efforts were often poorly planned and implemented in unsuitable climates, leading to widespread failures and ridicule from the public. On the urban front, Khrushchev championed mass housing projects to address the chronic overcrowding in Soviet cities. Millions of Khrushchevkas, functional yet Spartan apartment blocks, were constructed, providing affordable housing for countless families. While these buildings lacked the grandeur of Stalin, era architecture. They were a practical solution to the pressing housing crisis, symbolizing Khrushchev's commitment to improving the lives of Soviet citizens. The limits of the Khrushchev, though, were starkly demonstrated during the Hungarian uprising of 1956, a popular revolt against Soviet control inspired by Khrushchev's critiques of Stalinism. Hungarians demanded democratic reforms and greater autonomy from Moscow, challenging the Soviet Union's grip on its Eastern European satellites. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Soviet hold on Eastern Europe might weaken, as protests erupted across Hungary. However, when the uprising escalated into armed rebellion, Khrushchev responded with decisive force. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, crushing the revolt with brutal efficiency and resulting in thousands of deaths. The suppression of the Hungarian uprising sent a clear message to the Eastern Bloc. Any aspirations for liberty would be met with overwhelming force. Internationally, the Soviet crackdown drew widespread condemnation, highlighting the limits of Khrushchev's reforms and reinforcing the image of the USSR as a repressive regime. Khrushchev's leadership was marked by contradictions, both in his domestic policies and his approach to international relations. Abroad, he boldly confronted the West in high-profile showdowns, such as the famous kitchen debate with U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon, where the merits of capitalism and communism were hotly contested. However, his erratic behavior, including the infamous incident where he allegedly banged his shoe on a table at the United Nations, overshadowed his accomplishments and frustrated party officials. These inconsistencies, combined with economic challenges and dissatisfaction with his leadership style, ultimately led to Khrushchev's downfall. In 1964, he was summoned to a surprise meeting of the Politburo, where he was quietly forced into retirement. Khrushchev's removal marked the end of the era of cautious optimism and reform that had defined the Thaw, ushering in a period of conservatism under his successor, Leonid Brezhnev. Despite his polarizing legacy, Khrushchev's leadership revealed cracks in the foundation of the Soviet system and planted seeds of reform that would bear fruit in later years. The Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union extended beyond Earth, reaching into the vast expanse of outer space. By the mid-1950s, both superpowers were locked in a fierce competition for technological dominance in the final frontier, with each side eager to demonstrate its superiority. For the Soviet Union, the space race was a powerful symbol of progress and a means of showcasing the capabilities of the socialist system. The launch of Sputnik 1 on October 4, 1957, marked the beginning of the space age and catapulted the USSR into the global spotlight as a technological trailblazer. This achievement was followed shortly by the launch of Sputnik 2, which carried Laika, a stray dog from Moscow, into orbit as the first living creature to travel around the Earth. Although Laika did not survive the mission, her journey underscored Soviet ambition and the country's commitment to advancing space exploration. For Moscow, these milestones were not just scientific achievements, but also potent propaganda tools, reinforcing the narrative of the Soviet Union as a leader in innovation and progress. The success of the Soviet space program sparked fear and awe in the United States, prompting a renewed focus on scientific research and education as the Americans sought to catch up with their Cold War rivals. The space race thus became a defining aspect of the Cold War, with both superpowers investing heavily in their space programs and using their accomplishments to bolster their ideological claims. As the Soviet Union continued to push the boundaries of space exploration, it solidified its status as a global leader in science and technology, inspiring a generation of scientists and engineers, both at home and abroad. In the end, the Soviet Union's achievements in space became a lasting legacy of the Cold War era, symbolizing the heights of human ingenuity and the drive to explore the unknown. The chapter closes with a reflection on the profound impact of the Cold War on the Soviet Union and the world, setting the stage for the next chapter's exploration of the cultural and societal changes that emerged during this tumultuous period. The dawn of the space age was marked by a series of stunning advances, many of which were achieved by the Soviet Union. In 1959, the Luna 2 spacecraft became the first human-made object to reach the Moon. This accomplishment sent shockwaves through the global community, as it symbolized the Soviet Union's commitment to exploring the cosmos. The very same year, Luna 3 captured the first images of the Moon's far side, providing humanity with a glimpse of a landscape previously hidden from view. These milestones were not just scientific triumphs. They were powerful tools of propaganda. The Soviet regime used these achievements to promote the narrative that communism was leading humanity to unprecedented heights of technological and scientific progress. The media played a pivotal role in amplifying these successes. Newspapers and television broadcasts across the globe highlighted the Soviet accomplishments, often contrasting them with the American efforts, which were perceived as lagging. While the United States had launched its own satellite, Explorer 1, the Soviet accomplishments were often seen as more daring and groundbreaking. International reactions varied, with some nations expressing admiration and others, particularly in the West, viewing these achievements with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The Soviet space program was not only about exploration, it was also about demonstrating the superiority of the communist system and its ability to achieve what seemed impossible. Behind the curtain of Soviet triumphs lay a web of challenges and secrecy. The USSR's space program, while outwardly successful, was fraught with technical difficulties and failures. Incidents such as launchpad explosions and failed missions were meticulously covered up to maintain the facade of Soviet infallibility. Rumors of cosmonauts lost in space circulated, but were never officially confirmed. One of the most tragic incidents was the Nedelin catastrophe, a missile explosion in 1960 that resulted in the deaths of hundreds. This disaster was shrouded in secrecy, with the full extent of the tragedy hidden from the public eye for decades. The political implications of these failures were significant. A misstep in the space race could be perceived as a weakness of the communist regime, and thus, every effort was made to ensure that only successes were broadcast to the world. For Soviet scientists and engineers, the pressure was immense. They worked under the constant threat of failure and the necessity to innovate at an unprecedented pace, all while navigating the political demands of their government. In contrast, NASA operated with a level of transparency that was unimaginable in the Soviet Union. While the American space program had its failures, they were often public, leading to a culture of learning and adaptation that was less prevalent in the USSR. Yuri Gagarin's historic flight in 1961 marked a pinnacle in the space race. As the first human to orbit the Earth, Gagarin became an instant hero and an emblem of Soviet prowess. His mission aboard Vostok 1 was celebrated worldwide, and his image was broadcast as proof of communist progress. Yet beneath the accolades lay significant risks that were carefully concealed. The Vostok spacecraft lacked the ability to land safely, requiring Gagarin to eject and parachute to Earth. This critical detail was omitted from public accounts to preserve the image of a flawless mission. Gagarin's flight had a profound global impact. It galvanized the Soviet citizenry and inspired awe across the world, while simultaneously intensifying the already fierce competition with the United States. The psychological and physical challenges faced by early astronauts like Gagarin were immense. The unknowns of space travel, from the effects of zero gravity to the reliability of spacecraft systems, posed significant dangers that required immense courage to confront. The portrayal of Soviet astronauts in the media was carefully curated. They were depicted as fearless pioneers, embodying the strength and resolve of the Soviet people. This narrative was crucial in reinforcing the ideological battle being waged alongside the technological one. In October 1962, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded over 13 tense days, during which the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a high-stakes game of brinkmanship. The crisis began with the discovery of Soviet nuclear missile installations in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US coastline. American reconnaissance photos provided irrefutable evidence of missiles capable of reaching deep into the United States, posing an existential threat to American security. For the Kennedy administration, the presence of these missiles was more than a strategic challenge. It was a direct threat that required swift action. The Soviet decision to place missiles in Cuba was a calculated response to American nuclear weapons stationed in Turkey, which posed a direct threat to Soviet security. Additionally, Khrushchev sought to reinforce Cuba, the Soviet Union's only staunch ally in the Western Hemisphere, following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. The deployment of missiles served as a potent signal of Soviet resolve to protect its allies and challenge American dominance. President John F. Kennedy convened his closest advisors, known as the Executive Committee or XCOM, to deliberate on the U.S. response. Options ranged from military strikes to diplomatic engagements. Ultimately, Kennedy opted for a naval blockade, termed a quarantine, to prevent further Soviet shipments of military equipment to Cuba. This decision allowed Khrushchev time to reconsider, without immediate escalation. The term quarantine was deliberately chosen to avoid the war-like implications of an outright blockade. As tensions escalated, both nations prepared for potential conflict. Soviet ships continued toward Cuba, while U.S. military forces were placed on Def Zone 2, just one step away from nuclear war. Diplomacy took center stage as both sides exchanged letters and proposals, attempting to find a resolution without compromising their positions. Finally, Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. Unknown to the public, the agreement also included a secret commitment from Kennedy to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. The resolution of the crisis, achieved without a single shot, left a lasting impact on both superpowers. While Khrushchev portrayed the outcome as a diplomatic victory, his decision to back down was seen as a humiliation by many within his government, contributing to his eventual removal from power. The Cuban Missile Crisis had profound and lasting effects on international relations. Shaken by the near miss with nuclear catastrophe, both the United States and the Soviet Union took steps to prevent future close calls. The establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline provided a direct communication link between the leaders, reducing the risk of miscommunication in future crises. The crisis also spurred the first attempts at arms control agreements, though both nations continued to expand their nuclear arsenals in the years that followed. The psychological impact of the crisis was significant, instilling a heightened awareness of the destructive potential of nuclear weapons in populations around the world. This awareness fueled movements advocating for disarmament and peaceful coexistence. The lessons learned from the crisis influenced subsequent diplomatic engagements between the superpowers, emphasizing the importance of communication and negotiation in resolving international disputes. Despite the political fallout for Khrushchev, the crisis highlighted the potential for diplomacy to avert disaster, a lesson that would resonate through the remaining years of the Cold War. With the ascension of Leonid Brezhnev in 1964, the Soviet Union entered an era characterized by stability, or as some would argue, stagnation. Brezhnev's leadership marked a departure from Khrushchev's ambitious and often erratic policies, opting instead for a conservative approach focused on maintaining order. Under Brezhnev, the Soviet Union prioritized predictability and centralized authority, sidelining any attempts at reform in favor of preserving the status quo. This period saw a consolidation of power, with Brezhnev's regime emphasizing the importance of a developed socialist society. Economically, the Soviet Union faced challenges as the focus on heavy industry and military spending led to stagnation in consumer goods production and technological innovation. The cultural impact of the Brezhnev era was significant, with a focus on promoting stability and traditional values, often at the expense of artistic and intellectual freedom. While the Soviet Union maintained its status as a global superpower, the internal challenges of the Brezhnev era set the stage for future unrest and calls for reform. In the realm of foreign policy, Brezhnev continued to assert Soviet influence on the global stage, engaging in strategic alliances and supporting communist movements worldwide. However, the limitations of the Soviet economic model became increasingly apparent as the nation struggled to keep pace with technological advancements in the West. The Brezhnev era, while marked by stability, ultimately highlighted the need for change and reform, setting the stage for future leaders to address the challenges facing the Soviet Union. As the Cold War continued, the shadow of nuclear brinkmanship lingered, with both the United States and the Soviet Union aware of the potential consequences of miscalculation. The role of submarines and the near launch of nuclear weapons during the Cuban Missile Crisis served as a stark reminder of the fragile balance of power. The decisions made in those tense moments underscored the importance of clear communication and cautious diplomacy in preventing future conflicts. The Cold War, defined by a constant push and pull of power and ideology, continued to shape the geopolitical landscape, leaving a lasting legacy on the world stage. The Brezhnev era marked a time when the Soviet Union's grip on creative and intellectual expression tightened significantly. Censorship became a tool to ensure that all forms of media, from newspapers to books and films, strictly adhered to the Communist Party's ideology. Under Brezhnev's rule, the state sought to create a monolithic cultural landscape where dissenting voices were either suppressed or eliminated. Writers, thinkers, and scientists who dared to step outside the prescribed boundaries risked severe consequences, including imprisonment or exile. The KGB, the notorious state security agency, was omnipresent, ensuring that any hint of opposition was swiftly silenced. Surveillance was pervasive, creating an atmosphere of fear where individuals were wary of expressing their true thoughts. Though Brezhnev avoided the violent purges of Stalin's time, the era still cultivated a sense of quiet repression, conformity was valued over individuality, and the creative spirit that had previously surged in Soviet society was stifled under the weight of censorship. Internationally, the Soviet Union under Brezhnev continued to assert its military and ideological dominance. The introduction of the Brezhnev Doctrine in 1968 formalized Moscow's right to intervene in any socialist country to preserve communist rule. This doctrine was applied with brutal clarity during the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. Reformist leader Alexander Dubček introduced liberal reforms, including freedom of speech and decentralization of the economy. These changes, though hopeful for the Czech people, alarmed Brezhnev and the Politburo. They viewed such reforms as a threat to Soviet hegemony over the Eastern Bloc. The USSR led a Warsaw Pact invasion to crush the movement, demonstrating the lengths to which it would go to maintain control. This act became emblematic of the Brezhnev era's swift and unyielding control over its satellite states, even at the cost of international condemnation. The invasion of Czechoslovakia underscored the tension between the desire for reform in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union's determination to maintain its sphere of influence. Domestically, the Soviet economy was increasingly plagued by inefficiency and imbalance. The centralized planning system, once a symbol of Soviet strength, began to falter under rigid production quotas that prioritized quantity over quality. Factories turned out goods that were often defective or entirely unwanted. Consumer shortages became a staple of everyday life, with long lines and empty shelves becoming a defining image of the period. The economy's heavy reliance on oil exports masked deeper structural issues for a time, buoyed by high global oil prices in the 1970s. However, this dependence made the USSR particularly vulnerable to any shifts in the energy market. Despite extensive propaganda championing industrial progress, many Soviet citizens experienced declining living standards. The contrast between the grandiose ideals of socialism and the harsh realities of life led to growing dissatisfaction among the populace. The Soviet leadership under Brezhnev was characterized by a culture that valued loyalty and stability above innovation and competence. Hardline officials, often more interested in preserving their power than solving problems, thrived in an environment that rewarded obedience over competence. Corruption flourished, with bribery and black market dealings becoming commonplace among officials at every level. Meritocracy, where it existed, eroded in favor of a system more interested in preventing change than promoting progress. This culture of stagnation permeated every level of governance, leading to bureaucratic gridlock and a lack of meaningful reform. Despite fostering stagnation, Brezhnev carefully cultivated the image of a powerful and dignified leader. He awarded himself an extraordinary number of accolades, including over 100 medals during his tenure. His obsession with prestige sometimes bordered on the absurd, with his jacket reportedly requiring assistants to remain in place during ceremonial appearances. This excessive display of self-congratulation symbolized the gap between Soviet propaganda and its increasingly bleak realities. In 1979, the Soviet Union launched a military intervention in Afghanistan, a conflict that would soon spiral into one of the USSR's most devastating and costly endeavors. The situation began with Afghanistan's communist government, which had seized power a year earlier in a coup. This new regime, under the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, implemented radical reforms aimed at transforming Afghan society along Soviet-style lines. However, these changes clashed with the country's deeply entrenched Islamic traditions, sparking widespread unrest. the PDPA found itself under siege from Islamic insurgents known as the Mujahideen, who opposed both the government's ideology and its allegiance to Moscow. Fearing the collapse of a friendly regime on its southern border, the Soviet leadership decided to act. In December 1979, Soviet forces crossed into Afghanistan to stabilize the situation and support their allies in Kabul. The invasion was framed as a limited intervention, but the reality was far from limited. Tens of thousands of Soviet troops rolled across the border, accompanied by tanks, helicopters, and warplanes. Within days, a coup orchestrated by the Soviets removed the PDPA leader Hafizullah Amin, installing Babrak Karmal, a figure deemed more loyal and controllable. Yet, the new leadership changed little on the ground. The Mujahideen, scattered but fiercely motivated, continued to grow in strength, feeding on deep resentment toward the foreign occupiers. The conflict quickly evolved into a brutal guerrilla war. Afghanistan's rugged terrain, marked by towering mountains and isolated villages, proved ideal for the insurgents. Soviet tanks and heavy equipment struggled to navigate the narrow, winding roads, leaving them vulnerable to ambushes. The Red Army, though powerful on paper, was ill prepared for the kind of decentralized hit and run warfare waged by the Mujahideen. Local knowledge of the terrain gave the rebels a significant edge, allowing them to strike and disappear before Soviet forces could mount an effective response. Airstrikes and helicopter missions often targeted suspected insurgent strongholds, but these operations also resulted in widespread destruction and heavy civilian casualties. As the war dragged on, the United States and its allies saw an opportunity to exploit Soviet vulnerabilities. Through a covert operation codenamed Operation Cyclone, the CIA began funneling arms training and financial aid to the Mujahideen. Billions of dollars worth of weapons, including surface-to-air missiles like the Stinger, made their way into Afghanistan, allowing the insurgents to counter Soviet air superiority. Neighboring Pakistan served as a staging ground and logistical base, while Saudi Arabia also contributed significant funding. What started as a localized uprising now carried the backing of global powers, transforming Afghanistan into a Cold War proxy battleground. This international dimension added complexity to the conflict, as the Soviet Union found itself entangled in a war that was increasingly difficult to win. The prolonged nature of the conflict drained Soviet resources and morale, contributing to the broader sense of stagnation that characterized the Brezhnev era. By the late 1970s, the cracks in the Brezhnev system had become impossible to ignore. While the USSR remained a formidable military superpower, its society lagged in critical areas like technology, healthcare, and the standard of living. The long stretches of inaction and bureaucratic gridlock came to define Brezhnev's tenure. What began as an era of stability slowly became one of stagnation, a period that traded reform for inertia at a cost the Soviet Union would struggle to recover from in the years ahead. The legacy of Brezhnev's era was one of missed opportunities and unfulfilled potential, setting the stage for the challenges that would confront the Soviet Union in the following decade. The impact of these years was felt long after Brezhnev's death, as the Soviet Union grappled with the consequences of a system that had grown increasingly out of touch with the needs and aspirations of its people. As the world moved forward, the Soviet Union remained mired in the shadows of stagnation, a testament to the enduring influence of Brezhnev's policies. The Brezhnev era serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of prioritizing control over progress and the costs of stifling the human spirit in service of ideology. As the Cold War continued to shape the geopolitical landscape, the Soviet Union would face mounting pressures, both internally and externally, setting the stage for the transformative changes of the 1980s. The conflict in Afghanistan cast a long shadow over the Soviet Union, draining its resources and morale. Soviet soldiers stationed there faced not only a determined Mujahideen enemy, but also the harsh realities of the Afghan terrain and the growing disillusionment within their ranks. Many of these soldiers were young conscripts, hastily trained and ill, prepared for the complexities of a war fought in a land so culturally and geographically alien to them. The Soviet government's tight control over casualty information could not completely hide the grim reality. Reports of wounded veterans, along with coffins returning home, slowly eroded public support for the war. By the war's conclusion, over 15,000 Soviet soldiers had died. Tens of thousands were wounded, and countless others carried the psychological scars of their experiences. Meanwhile, the human cost for Afghanistan was staggering. Millions of Afghan civilians were killed, displaced, or forced to flee to neighboring countries as refugees. In their increasingly desperate attempts to suppress the insurgency, Soviet military tactics became more brutal. Scorched earth policies, carpet bombing of villages, planting landmines across vast areas, and targeting civilian infrastructure became common strategies. These actions, rather than subduing the Mujahideen, attracted sharp international criticism and further tarnished the Soviet Union's global reputation. Afghanistan became a diplomatic quagmire for the USSR, highlighting the high cost of projecting power abroad. By the mid-1980s, it was clear that the war was unwinnable. Under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, who sought to reform a faltering Soviet system, the Kremlin began seeking a way out. In 1988, an agreement was brokered for the withdrawal of Soviet troops, and by 1989, the last tanks rolled out of Afghanistan. The war left the Soviet Union deeply damaged, not only in military and economic terms, but also in its global standing. It was often referred to as the Soviet Vietnam, a conflict that exposed vulnerabilities in a superpower once deemed undefeatable. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev was appointed as the General Secretary of the Communist Party, marking a significant departure from the elderly, stagnant leadership that had characterized Soviet governance for decades. At just 54 years old, Gorbachev brought a vision of reform to the increasingly fragile Soviet system, believing that socialism could be saved by modernizing it. His two primary policies, perestroika and glasnost, became the heart of his transformative agenda. However, what began as a controlled initiative to address inefficiencies quickly spiraled into an uncontrollable wave of change. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, aimed to revitalize the stagnant economy, which had been stifled by decades of rigid central planning. Gorbachev introduced measures allowing for some market-like mechanisms, such as private ownership of small businesses and greater autonomy for state enterprises. Managers were encouraged to act independently, increasing efficiency and productivity. He also shifted focus from heavy industry to consumer goods, hoping to alleviate public frustration over chronic shortages. But these changes disoriented the economy instead of bolstering it. Without an established framework for competition or regulation, production faltered, and supply chain disruptions worsened existing shortages. While Gorbachev hoped to stabilize the system, inflation soared and public confidence in the reforms quickly eroded. Simultaneously, glasnost, meaning openness, radically transformed the social and political landscape. For the first time, transparency in government was encouraged. Censorship was relaxed, and the media gained the freedom to report on political corruption, environmental disasters, and historical injustices that had been suppressed for decades. This newfound openness allowed Soviet citizens to confront truths about their history, such as the brutality of Stalin's purges and the neglected cost of the ongoing war in Afghanistan. Public discourse erupted, with underground literature, known as samizdat, circulating openly. Once taboo books like Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago were published and eagerly read by a populace eager to understand their country's past. However, transparency came at a price. Rather than uniting the population around a shared vision of reform, glasnost fueled resentment and emboldened critics, including nationalist movements in various Soviet republics. What became clear was that Gorbachev's policies were unlocking pent-up grievances far beyond Moscow's control across the Soviet Union. Decades of suppressed ethnic tensions and desires for independence began boiling to the surface. In the Baltic republics like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, open calls for secession challenged the very unity of the USSR. Even within the Russian heartland, trust in the party continued to fracture. Reformers criticized Gorbachev for not going far enough, while hardliners accused him of betraying socialism altogether. Trapped between these opposing forces, Gorbachev found himself unable to fully satisfy either side. The Chernobyl disaster of April 26, 1986, became a pivotal event in Soviet history and a significant catalyst for change. A routine safety test at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant spiraled into catastrophe. Operators attempted to simulate a power outage, but a flawed reactor design and poorly trained staff initiated a chain reaction that they could not control. Within moments, a massive explosion tore through the reactor, sending a plume of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The disaster did not only affect Chernobyl or its surrounding area. Nuclear particles quickly spread across parts of Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond, reaching into Western Europe. The Soviet government's initial attempt to downplay the severity of the incident led to widespread outrage when the truth inevitably came to light. It highlighted the systemic flaws within the Soviet system and the dangers of secrecy and misinformation. Chernobyl became a symbol of the Soviet Union's decline, underscoring the urgent need for transparency and reform. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika gained further momentum in the wake of the disaster, as the public demanded accountability and change. Yet, the reforms also exposed deep-seated issues that were not easily resolved, instead of a revitalized union. These changes revealed a fragmented society in crisis. The Soviet Union was on the brink of significant transformation. But the path forward was fraught with challenges and uncertainties. As the Soviet Union faced these internal struggles, its global influence continued to wane. The Afghan War, economic turmoil, and internal dissent under Gorbachev contributed to the USSR's declining stature on the international stage. Cold War dynamics were shifting, and the Soviet Union's eventual dissolution became increasingly inevitable. The legacy of Soviet decline would continue to shape post-Cold War geopolitics, setting the stage for the emergence of a new world order. The Soviet Union's journey through these transformative years marked a turning point in history, with lessons that continue to resonate in today's global landscape. The story of a superpower's fall from grace serves as a powerful reminder of the complexities of governance, the necessity for reform, and the unpredictable nature of change. Wind patterns carried radioactive fallout from the Chernobyl explosion as far as Sweden and Germany, transforming a regional catastrophe into an international crisis. Radiation levels surged to unimaginable heights, yet the Soviet authorities hesitated, enshrouded in a web of secrecy and denial that was emblematic of the system. Even after the reactor's destruction, no official evacuations were ordered for nearly 2 days. In Pripyat, the closest city to Chernobyl, life continued as though nothing had happened. Families went about their daily routines, blissfully unaware of the toxic radiation that was enveloping them. When the truth could no longer be contained, the population of Pripyat, over 49,000 people, was evacuated within hours, leaving behind their homes, jobs, and possessions. More than 100,000 individuals from surrounding areas were ultimately forced to flee, many exposed to harmful doses of radiation that would haunt them for years to come. Despite the mounting evidence of contamination, Soviet authorities continued to downplay the risks. Western countries began to detect suspiciously high radiation levels crossing their borders. Sweden, over 1,000 kilometers away, demanded an explanation, compelling the Soviet government to finally admit the magnitude of what had occurred. The cleanup of Chernobyl was branded as a patriotic act by the state, a Herculean task known as the liquidation, which involved mobilizing over 600,000 workers to contain the damage. These liquidators, a diverse group of soldiers, miners, firefighters, and engineers, were sent into the hazardous zone with minimal preparation and inadequate safety equipment. Many found themselves working directly next to the reactor's remains, using shovels and manual tools to clear radioactive debris. Such was the intensity of the radiation that even advanced machinery would fail. Consequently, these workers constructed a massive concrete sarcophagus to seal off reactor number 4, a temporary solution aimed at preventing further radioactive leakage. For many of the liquidators, exposure led to radiation sickness, long-term health complications, and in some cases death. Despite their sacrifice, the health impact on liquidators and their families became a contested legacy of the disaster. Chernobyl exposed deep flaws within the Soviet system, extending far beyond the immediate disaster. Investigations revealed that safety protocols had been routinely cut and concerns from engineers silenced. Even the reactor's design, once lauded as a symbol of Soviet scientific prowess, contained a known fatal flaw. It became dangerously unstable during low-power tests, such as the one conducted on that fateful night. Chernobyl was a glaring example of how bureaucracy and the fear of accountability had paralyzed meaningful action, costing lives unnecessarily. Under Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, the slow response of the Soviet government only confirmed suspicions that truth was often buried to preserve appearances. The aftermath of Chernobyl extended beyond structural damage and contaminated soil. The legacy of the disaster includes a profound human cost. Thousands of cancer diagnoses have been attributed to the fallout, while countless others continue to grapple with the trauma of displacement and disruption to their lives. The exclusion zone, a 30-kilometer radius around the plant, remains uninhabited decades later, standing as an eerie ghost town frozen in time. One of the most shocking examples of official negligence occurred just days after the explosion. In Kiev, roughly 100 kilometers from the reactor, children were sent to participate in May Day parades under a sky heavy with radioactive particles. Postponing public ceremonies would have been an admission of the disaster's severity, a scenario the government was desperate to avoid. Years later, these decisions were exposed, exacerbating the public's distrust in the state. If glasnost was beginning to pry open the truth, Chernobyl ripped the door off entirely. Inspired by Gorbachev's reforms, public movements in Eastern Europe began pushing openly for change. A critical factor in this unraveling was Gorbachev's deliberate decision to abandon the Brezhnev Doctrine. This policy, enacted after the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, had justified the use of military force to maintain communist rule in Eastern Bloc nations. By renouncing this approach, Gorbachev signaled to Soviet satellite states that they would no longer face armed intervention if they pursued reform or change. It was a significant shift in Soviet foreign policy, revealing Moscow's weakened grip on the region. Without the immediate threat of tanks rolling into their capitals, leaders and citizens began to take matters into their own hands. The revolutions began quietly, but quickly gathered momentum. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, which had operated underground for years, gained legal status. By June 1989, the first mostly free elections in decades took place, leading to a resounding victory for reformers. Meanwhile, in Hungary, legislative border and leadership changes signaled a tide of reform. Hungary's decision to open its border with Austria set off a chain reaction as thousands of East Germans used the opportunity to escape to the west, creating a political crisis back in Berlin. East Germany, long a symbol of Soviet control in Europe, faced an unprecedented wave of protest. By November 1989, demonstrations had peaked with hundreds of thousands, taking to the streets demanding freedom to travel and genuine reform. The pressure led to confusion within the East German government. On the evening of November 9th, an unprepared official mistakenly announced the immediate opening of border crossings. Crowds surged to the Berlin Wall, which had stood for nearly 3 decades as a physical and ideological divider. In a matter of hours, the wall was breached. People from both sides celebrated, hammering at the concrete, symbolically and literally dismantling a system that had divided families and nations. Images of the Berlin Wall's collapse circled the globe, becoming an enduring symbol of the end of the Soviet era in Eastern Europe. Soon, other dominoes followed. The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, named for its peaceful nature, overturned the communist government in weeks. In Bulgaria, sustained public demonstrations forced the resignation of its long-standing leader. Romania saw the most violent change. The fiercely oppressive dictator Nicholas II was toppled by an armed uprising. He and his wife were captured and executed on Christmas Day in 1989. The televised trial and execution were a grim epilogue to the decades of harsh rule that Romanians had endured. For the Soviet Union, these upheavals were nothing short of a seismic loss. Eastern Europe had long been its buffer zone, a collection of states that represented not only ideological triumph, but also territorial security. Their sudden collapse was a testament to the fragile nature of Soviet control. The system had relied on the fear of intervention rather than genuine loyalty. As the dust settled, the world witnessed a new geopolitical landscape. The events in Eastern Europe illustrated the complexities of governance, the necessity for reform, and the unpredictable nature of change. The collapse of the Eastern Bloc was a momentous event that reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the late 20th century. With it came a mix of triumph and turbulence as nations broke free from Soviet domination, each embarking on a unique path toward autonomy. This transition, however, was fraught with challenges as the region grappled with building new political systems and adapting to market economies. the fall of the Eastern Bloc was viewed by many as a triumph of democracy and self-determination over authoritarianism. For decades, nations under Soviet influence were subject to strict control and limited freedoms. The collapse offered these countries an opportunity to redefine their identities and pursue their destinies. Yet, this newfound freedom was met with significant turbulence. The rapid transition from centrally planned economies to market systems created economic instability and hardship. Industries collapsed, unemployment soared, and inflation skyrocketed, causing widespread suffering among the populace. People who had long yearned for freedom quickly realized that the path to prosperity and stability was strewn with difficulties. International influence played a crucial role during this transition. Western countries, seeing an opportunity to expand their influence and promote democratic values, provided aid and guidance. However, the imposition of Western economic models often clashed with local realities, leading to mixed results. The psychological impact on the populace was profound. Years of living under oppressive regimes had left deep scars, and the sudden shift to a freer society was daunting. The uncertainty of the future, combined with economic hardships, led to a sense of disillusionment among many. Comparisons with other historical transitions, such as the fall of colonial empires, highlight the complexities and unpredictability of such transformations. Rebuilding political systems in the wake of the Eastern Bloc's collapse was a monumental task. Overnight, nations had to dismantle their existing political structures and create new ones that reflected democratic principles. This process was often chaotic and marked by instability. In some countries, the transition went relatively smoothly, resulting in stable democratic institutions. In others, the process was marred by corruption, power struggles, and the rise of authoritarian tendencies. The role of international aid and advice was critical in shaping these new political landscapes. Organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank provided financial assistance and policy recommendations. However, the implementation of these recommendations was not always successful, as they sometimes failed to account for the unique social and economic conditions of each country. The transition from planned economies to market economies was equally challenging. Many state-owned enterprises were privatized, often resulting in the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few. This led to significant social and economic disparities, exacerbating tensions and unrest. Case studies of successful and failed transitions offer valuable insights into the factors that contribute to stability and growth. Countries that manage to establish transparent and accountable institutions foster social cohesion and implement sound economic policies were generally more successful in navigating the transition. One of the most enduring legacies of the Eastern Bloc's collapse was the exposure of the extensive surveillance systems that had been in place. In East Germany, the Stasi had maintained a vast network of informants and collected files on around 1/3 of the adult population. The fall of the regime led to a rush by citizens to uncover or destroy these records, revealing the suffocating extent of life under constant watch. The societal impact of uncovering these records was profound. For many, it was a traumatic experience to discover the extent to which their lives had been monitored and controlled. Personal stories from citizens affected by the surveillance illustrate the deep sense of betrayal and violation of trust. The exposure of these systems also sparked broader discussions about privacy and civil liberties. Comparisons with other secret police organizations, such as the KGB, highlight the pervasive nature of state surveillance during this period. In the modern era, reflections on privacy continue to be relevant, as advances in technology have raised new concerns about government surveillance and data privacy. The lessons learned from the exposure of these surveillance systems serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked state power. In August 1991, the Soviet Union faced a critical turning point as a group of hardline officials attempted a coup to preserve the old order. This State Committee on the State of Emergency was composed of high-ranking Soviet officials, including members of the KGB and the military. They were fiercely opposed to Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms and sought to restore the centralized control of the Soviet state. The coup plotters made a dramatic move to isolate Gorbachev, placing him under house arrest while he was on vacation in Crimea. They declared a state of emergency in Moscow and took control of key government institutions. However, their attempt to seize power quickly unraveled. Boris Yeltsin, the recently elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, emerged as a leading figure of opposition. Standing atop a tank outside the Russian parliament, Yeltsin delivered a call to action, urging citizens to resist the coup. His bold stance galvanized public support and emboldened parts of the military to defy orders from the coup leaders. The role of media, empowered by Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, was crucial in broadcasting the events live. The transparency that the coup leaders sought to extinguish instead worked against them, exposing their weaknesses and rallying public support for democratic reforms. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed. Gorbachev was released, but the damage to his authority was irreversible. The Communist Party, deeply implicated in the plot, was banned in Russia by the end of the year. Yeltsin's leadership during the crisis propelled him to the forefront of Russian politics, symbolizing a shift toward democratic reforms. The failure of the coup ignited a chain reaction across the Soviet republics, accelerating their push for independence. The weakening grip of the central government emboldened republics like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Ukraine to declare sovereignty. These declarations effectively dismantled what remained of Soviet unity. Boris Yeltsin's rising popularity and leadership provided a focal point for resistance against the old Soviet structure. The broadcasted chaos of the coup made it clear that the Soviet system was beyond repair, hastening its collapse. As republics declared independence, negotiations for a restructured federation faltered. Mikhail Gorbachev's efforts to salvage the Union through a looser federation were met with resistance. The concept of complete independence had taken hold, and the republics were unwilling to settle for half measures. Negotiations stagnated, and Gorbachev found himself increasingly isolated. The decisive blow to the Soviet Union came on December 8, 1991, when the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a secluded hunting lodge in Belarus. Boris Yeltsin, Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk, and Belarusian leader Stanislav Shushkevich signed the Belavecha Accords. The agreement formally declared that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist and announced the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, as a successor entity. This remarkable agreement bypassed Gorbachev entirely, marking the end of the Soviet Union. The dissolution of the USSR was a pivotal moment in world history, signaling the end of a superpower that had once challenged Western dominance. It marked the beginning of a new era, characterized by the rise of independent nation-states and a shift in global power dynamics. The collapse of the Soviet Union offers valuable lessons for understanding the complexities of governance and the unpredictable nature of change. Comparisons with other fallen empires highlight the challenges of maintaining control over diverse populations and the inevitability of change. The influence of the Soviet Union's dissolution on post-Cold War international relations continues to be felt today. The legacy of Soviet policies and their impact on current Russian governance remain subjects of significant interest and debate. As we reflect on the end of the Soviet Union, it is important to recognize the enduring legacy of its policies and the lessons they offer for the future. The dissolution of the USSR was not just an end, but a beginning of new possibilities and challenges for the nations that emerged from its shadow. The dissolution of the Soviet Union remains one of the most pivotal events of the 20th century, marking the end of a vast and powerful empire that had dominated global politics for nearly 7 decades, from its inception as a revolutionary state in 1917 to its final days in December 1991. The Soviet Union's journey was one of extraordinary achievements and devastating failures. The collapse of this superpower was not a sudden event, but the culmination of a series of complex political, economic, and social factors that had been building over time. The Soviet Union's disintegration was precipitated by a multitude of internal and external pressures. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, introduced reforms such as perestroika and glasnost in an attempt to revitalize the stagnating economy and open up the repressive political system. These reforms, however, inadvertently accelerated the unraveling of the Soviet state. Perestroika, aimed at restructuring the economic system, led to economic turmoil as it failed to replace the central planning model with a functional market economy. Glasnost, or openness, allowed for unprecedented freedom of expression, which unleashed a wave of criticism against the government and exposed the deep-seated issues within the system. The August coup of 1991, an attempt by hardline communists to seize control from Gorbachev, further destabilized the Soviet Union. The coup's failure emboldened independence movements within the republics, and by the end of 1991, all 15 republics had declared independence. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time at the Kremlin, symbolizing the official end of the Soviet Union. The dissolution of the Soviet Union resulted in the emergence of 15 independent states, each facing its own unique set of challenges. Ukraine, with its rich agricultural land and industrial base, struggled with political instability and economic reform. Its path towards democracy was marred by corruption and power struggles. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, rapidly embraced market economies and sought integration with Western Europe, joining both the European Union and NATO. These republics experienced a cultural and economic renaissance, shedding Soviet legacies and asserting their national identities. Central Asian republics, like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, faced different challenges. These nations had to navigate the transition from Soviet centralization to independence, while grappling with ethnic tensions, economic underdevelopment, and the establishment of new political systems. Nationalism surged across the former Soviet landscape, sometimes leading to regional conflicts, as newly independent states sought to define themselves and secure their sovereignty. One of the most pressing issues following the Soviet Union's collapse was the fate of its nuclear arsenal. With thousands of nuclear warheads scattered across several new republics, the potential for proliferation was a significant global concern. Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan inherited large portions of this arsenal. International efforts, such as the Non-Luga Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, were crucial in securing and dismantling these weapons. Ukraine, for example, agreed to denuclearization in exchange for security assurances, becoming a non-nuclear state by 1996. These efforts significantly reduced the risk of nuclear proliferation and highlighted the importance of international cooperation in addressing the legacy of the Soviet Union's military might. Despite its authoritarian nature, the Soviet Union made substantial contributions to science, technology, and culture. The space race is perhaps its most celebrated achievement, with the launch of Sputnik in 1957, marking the dawn of the space age. Yuri Gagarin's historic flight, as the first human in space, remains a symbol of Soviet ingenuity and ambition. The USSR's commitment to education transformed a largely illiterate peasantry into a literate and educated populace. This focus on education fostered advancements in various fields, from physics to engineering, positioning the Soviet Union as a scientific powerhouse. Culturally, the Soviet Union was a patron of the arts. State-sponsored programs in music, ballet, and cinema flourished, producing works that remain influential to this day. However, these cultural achievements often served propagandistic purposes, reflecting the regime's ideological underpinnings. The Cold War, defined by the ideological and military rivalry between the US and the USSR, shaped global politics for nearly half a century. This bipolar world order ended with the Soviet Union's collapse, ushering in a unipolar era dominated by the United States. The dissolution of the USSR led to the disbandment of the Warsaw Pact and the expansion of NATO. As Eastern European countries transitioned towards democracy and market economies, the end of the Cold War also influenced global economic systems. As former socialist states embraced capitalism and sought integration into the global economy, the Soviet Union's governance model, characterized by a one-party system and centralized control, left a lasting legacy in many of its successor states. In Russia, elements of this system have persisted, with Vladimir Putin's leadership often reflecting a blend of authoritarianism and nationalism. Central Asian republics have similarly inherited centralized governance structures, limiting democratic freedoms and maintaining tight control over their societies. The legacy of Soviet governance continues to shape the political landscape of the region, influencing contemporary politics and governance. The Soviet Union was a nation of stark contrasts. Its achievements in science and industry were monumental, yet they were often overshadowed by the human cost of its oppressive political regime. Collectivization led to famine, and state-sponsored purges resulted in the deaths of millions. The Gulag system and the suppression of dissent exemplified the regime's brutality. These contradictions highlight the duality of the Soviet Union's legacy, a triumph of human ingenuity on one hand, and a cautionary tale of ideological extremism on the other. The legacy of the Soviet Union remains a subject of intense debate. For some, it represents an era of stability, guaranteed employment, and superpower status. In Russia, nostalgia for the Soviet past is evident in the selective embrace of its symbols and achievements. Vladimir Putin has used this nostalgia to unify Russia and project power, while avoiding reflection on the darker aspects of Soviet history. Yet, for many, the Soviet Union is remembered for its repressive policies and the hardships endured under its regime. Monuments, museums, and public memorials across the former Soviet states serve as reminders of the Gulag system, the purges, and the human cost of rapid industrialization. The debate about the Soviet Union's achievements and failures remains deeply divisive, reflecting the complex and multifaceted nature of its legacy. The Soviet Union, once a superpower that spanned a sixth of the Earth's landmass, is now a part of history. Its collapse marked the end of an era and the beginning of new possibilities and challenges for the nations that emerged from its shadow. The Soviet Union is gone, but its impact continues to resonate across the globe, shaping the world we live in today.